October 25th, 1957, 9:18 p.m., Harlem, 125th Street, 2 doors off Lenox Avenue. Albert Anastasia was already inside when the first man noticed him. He didn't arrive with the parade. He didn't announce himself. He moved through the front room like a customer who belonged there, coat still on, eyes working faster than his feet. The place was loud enough to hide a threat, and clean enough to pretend it wasn't a business meeting. A band played soft. Glasses clinked. Men laughed a half-second too late. Anastasia took the back table that gave him a view of the door, the bar, and the narrow hallway leading to the private room upstairs. He didn't sit in the center of the cushion. He sat on the edge as if he might stand again without warning. He glanced once at the wall clock, then at the man behind the bar, then at the stairwell. 3 checks, 3 exits. No wasted motion. Across the room, a Harlem operator paused mid-sentence, watching the way the Italians with Anastasia didn't look around. They didn't scan for danger like visitors. They watched the room the way men watch property. That was the problem. In Harlem, ownership wasn't declared. It was enforced. A waiter approached. Anastasia didn't need a menu. He ordered coffee. Black, no sugar. He set the cup down untouched. Upstairs, the meeting had already started without him. Names had been said. Numbers had been slid across a table. A decision had been shaped into something quiet enough to deny later. The plan wasn't to confront Anastasia. The plan was to manage him, move him, contain him, charge him for stepping into a neighborhood that wasn't his. At 9:21, a chair scraped upstairs. Not an accident, a signal. Anastasia stood before anyone told him to. He adjusted his coat once, like a man preparing for weather, and walked to the stairwell with the calm of someone who did not come to negotiate his right to breathe. By the time the door upstairs opened, Harlem understood something it had not wanted to test. This wasn't an Italian coming for a cut. This was a man stepping into another man's territory to find out what kind of loyalty still held when fear had better offers. And what happened in that room didn't just settle a dispute. It rewrote who could be touched and who had become too expensive to try. The wall table and the error that wasn't an accident. In 1957, Harlem was fast money and slow pride. The kind of place where the wrong gesture could cost you a block, but the right one could buy you a decade of quiet. Anastasia wasn't from Harlem, and that was exactly why his presence there felt like a provocation. He wasn't looking for acceptance. He was testing resistance. Albert Anastasia had spent his life learning that rooms told the truth before men did. A room could be friendly and still be hostile. It could serve you a drink and still be measuring where you sat, who greeted you, who didn't. Harlem rooms were especially honest because Harlem relied on ritual to maintain order. Who entered first? Who spoke first? Who got a chair near the wall, near the exit, near the power? Anastasia chose the wall table because it forced the room to declare itself. From that angle he could see the entrance without turning his head. He could see who came in alone and who came in protected. He could see the pause that happens when people recognize a name they didn't expect to see in their neighborhood. It was not a comfortable seat. It was a control point. The men running Harlem's street economy understood the message immediately. An outsider could pass through, even do business, as long as he looked temporary. Anastasia didn't look temporary. He looked settled. That was the difference between a visitor and a challenge. Not because he spoke, because he didn't. Pressure arrived the way it always did in places that needed to keep their pride intact. Not with threats, with adjustments. The service slowed just enough to register. Familiar faces stopped making eye contact. The laughter at nearby tables sharpened into something performative, like men reminding themselves the room still belonged to them. Anastasia didn't correct them. He let them continue. That was the mistake. Harlem operators had seen Italians come uptown before. Usually they came to collect, to tax, to push for a share. Those men traveled with noise, with bodyguards who wanted to be noticed. Anastasia did the opposite. He arrived calm, with little visible muscle, and sat like a man who didn't need to prove he could enforce his decisions. That restraint was misread as vulnerability. The plan that formed around him wasn't built on bravado. It was built on maintenance. If Harlem allowed a man like Anastasia to sit there without consequence, it would invite more of the same. More business, more quiet demands, more erosion disguised as partnership. Pride couldn't afford to let that precedent settle. So they made a decision the way underworld decisions are usually made, quietly, through an intermediary, through money that didn't look like money, through a promise that sounded like protection. They chose a man close enough to Anastasia to act without raising alarms, and pressured him until the job felt less like betrayal and more like inevitability. But Anastasia hadn't walked into Harlem to be welcomed. He had walked in to find out who would move first. The wall table did its work. It separated curiosity from intent. It showed him who watched, who avoided, who signaled upstairs, who pretended not to notice. By the time the room believed it had surrounded him, Anastasia already understood the outline of what they were trying to do. And once an enemy reveals the shape of their plan, the rest is no longer a confrontation. It becomes a demonstration. Big Sam, loyalty as a job, survival as a debt. Big Sam wasn't born a traitor. He became one when he learned loyalty doesn't pay hospital bills, doesn't stop evictions, doesn't protect a daughter when someone decides to squeeze. In the underworld, men don't break from ambition as often as they break from pressure. And when they break, the city uses them. For years, Sam's value had been reliability. He showed up early. He stayed late. He didn't ask questions that forced men to explain themselves. Around Anastasia, he was presence more than personality. Muscle that didn't need to be reminded what side it belonged to. In exchange, he was allowed proximity, protection by association, a living, but proximity is not ownership, and protection has limits that are never written down. When Sam's personal problems began stacking up, they did so quietly. A notice slipped under the apartment door. A hospital bill that didn't care who he worked for. A daughter who asked questions Sam didn't know how to answer without lying. None of that reached Anastasia's desk. It wasn't supposed to. The pressure came from elsewhere. Men who knew Sam's role, but not his loyalty. Men who didn't threaten directly because direct threats create witnesses. They talked instead about consequences that had already happened to other people, about families that had been forced to move, about kids who learned fear early. They framed help as timing, as an opportunity that wouldn't come twice. They also framed it as temporary, one job, one decision. Enough money to clear the board and start fresh. $50,000 felt less like greed and more like oxygen. Sam didn't see himself as choosing sides. He saw himself buying time. That was the lie that made it possible. Sam told himself Anastasia was too insulated to notice. That men at the top didn't feel the movement of people beneath them until it was too late. He mistook Anastasia's calm for distance. He didn't understand that men like Anastasia survived by reading shifts before they became visible. The moment Sam accepted the money, the role closed around him. He wasn't being trusted. He was being used. Chosen because he was close enough to act and pressured enough not to hesitate. In underworld planning, desperation is more reliable than loyalty. By the time Sam stood behind Anastasia in Harlem, the decision no longer felt like a decision. It felt like completion, like finishing something that had started weeks earlier. His hands knew what to do even as his mind resisted it. What Sam didn't understand was that survival bought this way is never permanent. Debt changes shape, but it doesn't disappear. The city always collects. When the moment came, Sam believed he was acting to save his family. He didn't realize he was stepping into a role the city had already written for him, one where loyalty had expired, and survival came due immediately. $50,000, and the men who get paid without getting dirty. The money didn't come out of a pocket. It came off a table, from a conversation where nobody raised their voice and nobody wrote anything down. In New York, real orders didn't come with signatures. They came through intermediaries who smiled like salesmen and made promises that looked like rescue until they became a chain. The men who arranged it never intended to be seen. That was the point. Their value came from distance. They didn't pull triggers. They didn't sit in the room when decisions turned violent. They connected needs to solutions and walked away before the consequences arrived. In the underworld, that kind of cleanliness passed for intelligence. The $50,000 wasn't chosen for shock. It was chosen for balance. Too little, and Sam would hesitate. Too much, and the intent would feel reckless. This number lived in the narrow space where morality could be reframed as practicality, enough to erase immediate danger, enough to justify urgency, enough to make delay feel irresponsible. The pitch wasn't framed as murder. It was framed as maintenance. Anastasia was described as a disruption, an outside force testing boundaries that had taken years to stabilize. Harlem didn't need chaos. It needed correction. The intermediaries spoke in calm language about preserving order, about preventing escalation, about handling a problem before it invited larger ones. Violence was implied, never stated. They also sold inevitability. Sam was told that others were already aligned, that if he didn't act, someone else would, that his role wasn't decisive, only convenient. Men agree to terrible things more easily when they believe refusal won't change the outcome. What the intermediaries understood better than they admitted was that money changes behavior faster than ideology. Once the cash moved, the conversation ended. The moment Sam accepted it, the circle widened. Every hand it passed through became implicated. That was the real function of the payment. It wasn't compensation. It was contamination. The men who stayed clean counted on that. They believed distance insulated them, that being adjacent to violence without participating in it made them untouchable. They assumed that if something went wrong, attention would collapse inward, toward the man holding the gun, not outward toward the man who had loaded the circumstances. They underestimated Anastasia's relationship with patterns. He didn't chase rumors. He watched acceleration. Money changing hands leaves traces in behavior. Men rush, timelines compress. Mistakes multiply. $50,000 moved too quickly to stay invisible. By the time the plan reached its final shape, the intermediaries believed the outcome was already decided. Anastasia would be removed. Harlem would stabilize, the city would continue. What they failed to account for was that Anastasia didn't react to plans. He absorbed them. And once he understood who needed him gone badly enough to pay for it, the money stopped being leverage. It became evidence. Why Anastasia walked into Harlem when he didn't have to. Albert Anastasia had power elsewhere. He had men. He had reputation. He had the kind of name that made problems change direction. But Harlem wasn't just another corner on a map. It was a symbol, and stepping into it meant accepting one rule. If you cross that line, someone will try to charge you for it. Anastasia understood that rule as a certainty, not a risk. Harlem's authority didn't come from muscle alone. It came from continuity, from decades of understanding who collected, who protected, who punished, and who stayed in their lane. Outsiders weren't hated, they were managed, as long as they appeared temporary. Anastasia didn't appear temporary. He came uptown openly, without apology, without intermediaries smoothing the edges. He didn't ask permission, because permission creates obligation. Instead, he created presence. He let Harlem decide whether to tolerate it. That was the test. There was no immediate financial need pulling him north. His money came in reliably from docks, unions, and routes that never crossed 125th Street. That absence of necessity mattered. Men driven by hunger are predictable. Men driven by curiosity are not. Anastasia wanted to see how Harlem reacted to a man who didn't need them. He was also measuring response time. How long before the room adjusted? How long before meetings moved upstairs? How long before familiar faces started checking exits instead of watches? Harlem compressed reactions. It was dense. Decisions happened faster there that made it useful. Anastasia wasn't trying to take Harlem. He was identifying fault lines. Who felt threatened? Who felt confident? Who mistook silence for weakness? A territory reveals itself most clearly when it believes it's being tested unfairly. By placing himself inside Harlem's boundaries, Anastasia accelerated choices that might have taken months to surface. He forced men to decide whether pride was worth risk, whether autonomy was worth blood, whether they believed their structure could absorb an outsider without bending. The move also unsettled alliances that preferred to stay theoretical. Italians who claimed distance suddenly paid attention. Harlem operators who insisted on independence began making quiet calls. Lines blurred. That blur exposed where loyalty ended and where convenience began. Anastasia never explained his intentions because explanations invite negotiation. Uncertainty forced action. And action, especially rushed action, produces mistakes. Walking into Harlem wasn't bravado, it was calculation. Anastasia believed that any power structure worth respecting would respond decisively. And if it didn't, it wasn't stable. The attempt on his life didn't surprise him. It confirmed the answer he came to find. Harlem would protect its pride before it protected its people. Once that was clear, the rest followed on its own. The Lenox Room, where respect gets measured without witnesses. The private room wasn't built for comfort. It was built for leverage. The door closed clean, the walls held sound. and the only window faced an alley where nobody asked questions. Harlem meetings weren't ceremonies, they were audits. Who had earned, who had stolen, who had started believing the street belonged to them. The Lenox Room existed to settle questions before they spilled into the open. Men sat there to be measured, not persuaded. Chairs were placed with intention. The head of the table wasn't a position of honor so much as exposure. Anyone who sat there accepted responsibility for what followed. Silence in that room carried more weight than speech anywhere else. That night, the room filled before Anastasia arrived. That alone said something. Decisions had already been outlined. Numbers passed hand to hand. Names were spoken carefully, then not repeated. The tone wasn't aggressive. It was procedural. Harlem preferred correction to spectacle. If a problem could be handled quietly, it was. If not, it was made instructive. Anastasia entered without ceremony. No greeting, no apology for being late. He didn't claim a seat immediately. He stood for a moment, letting the room adjust to his presence, letting the men inside decide how they would hold themselves. Respect in rooms like this wasn't demanded, it was observed. When he finally sat, it wasn't at the head of the table. It was one seat off, close enough to matter, far enough to signal he wasn't there to ask permission. That choice unsettled the balance. The room had prepared for confrontation. It hadn't prepared for indifference. Harlem's operators understood leverage. They had built their authority on it. Community ties, street enforcement, the unspoken agreement that disputes stayed internal. Anastasia's presence threatened none of that directly. It threatened the assumption that Harlem controlled the terms of every conversation held within its walls. The questions began indirectly. Comments about timing, about business climates, about outsiders misunderstanding the neighborhood. No accusations, just framing. Anastasia listened without responding. He didn't interrupt, he didn't correct. He let the men speak themselves into position. That restraint was interpreted as weakness by some. Others recognized it as patience. In the Lenox Room, patience was dangerous. It meant someone was waiting for confirmation, not consensus. The audit reached its quiet conclusion without resolution. No vote, no declaration. Just a shared understanding that something had shifted and would need to be addressed elsewhere. That was the nature of Harlem power. Problems didn't explode. They relocated. By the time Anastasia stood to leave, the room believed it had retained control. He hadn't challenged authority. He hadn't issued threats. He hadn't demanded tribute. That absence felt like relief. It wasn't. The Lenox Room had measured Anastasia, but Anastasia had measured it back, and the numbers didn't favor the men who thought the meeting had ended. The gun that doesn't fire and the strategy that humiliates without blood, a useless gun isn't always a malfunction. Sometimes it is a trap built to make a traitor expose himself without forcing you to hunt him. Anastasia didn't need a shootout inside a Harlem lounge. He needed witnesses. He needed betrayal to have a shape, a face, and public shame before any private punishment. Violence was never Anastasia's opening move. It was his punctuation. What mattered was the sentence that came before it. A clean killing would have erased context. It would have collapsed the room into chaos and allowed everyone else to pretend they had nothing to do with it. A failure did the opposite. It froze time. It turned intent into evidence. When the trigger clicked and nothing followed, the room became a mirror. Big Sam stood exposed, arms still raised, caught between action and consequence. There was no ambiguity left to negotiate, no accident to explain. Every man present understood what had just been revealed and what had not. Anastasia was alive. The traitor was visible, and the rest of them were implicated by proximity. Anastasia didn't react immediately. That delay mattered. Men expect retaliation to be loud and fast. When it isn't, fear fills the gap. The pause forced everyone to ask the same question privately. What does he know, and how long has he known it? That uncertainty did more damage than shouting ever could. The failed shot also inverted the hierarchy. A man with a gun is supposed to control the moment. When the gun doesn't work, control transfers instantly to the man who survives it without panic. Anastasia stayed seated. He didn't reach for cover. He didn't signal his men. He let the room absorb the imbalance it had created. Humiliation is more durable than pain. A man beaten in private can recover. A man exposed in public carries it with him. The people who saw Sam fail would never fully trust him again. Neither would the men who had quietly supported the plan. Reputation doesn't survive moments like that. It fractures. Anastasia understood that blood would only shorten the lesson. By withholding it, he extended the consequences. Everyone left that room replaying the same sound in their head. Not a gunshot. A click. A small mechanical confirmation that the plan they had invested in was flawed at its core. The gun didn't need to fire. It had already done its work. It identified the traitor. It humiliated the conspirators. And it announced something Harlem had not wanted to hear. Albert Anastasia could be tested, but he could not be rushed. And men who confuse the two rarely get a second chance. The second after the click. Who moves and who stays still when the shot didn't come? The room revealed its real hierarchy. The ones who hid, the ones who looked down, the ones who instinctively found a door, and the ones who stayed still because they understood movement was confession. In that single second, Anastasia measured everyone without saying a word. Panic does not arrive evenly. It fractures. One man freezes. Another shifts his weight. A third reaches for something and stops halfway, realizing too late that the motion itself is a declaration. That second after the click stretched longer than any argument. Long enough for instincts to override loyalty. Long enough for truth to surface without being asked. The men closest to Big Sam reacted first. Not with courage, but with distance. Bodies angled away. Chairs scraped back just enough to break association. They hadn't planned the act, but they had known enough not to be surprised. That hesitation placed them exactly where Anastasia would remember them later, close to guilt, far from trust. Across the room, older Harlem operators stayed still. Their hands rested flat, their faces blank. They understood the rules of moments like this. Survive first, speak later. Movement could be interpreted as panic. Panic could be interpreted as participation. Stillness was the only defensible position. Near the doorway, two men shifted almost in unison, not running, not advancing, just testing space. Anastasia didn't look at them directly. He didn't need to. Men who locate exits before threats resolve are rarely decision-makers. They are contingency. Useful when things go wrong, disposable when things go right. Anastasia cataloged it all. He wasn't guessing motives. He was observing reactions. Reaction is more honest than explanation. Anyone can rehearse loyalty. No one rehearses surprise. Big Sam remained frozen at the center of the room. His stillness wasn't discipline. It was disbelief. The moment had slipped past him. He had expected noise. He had expected finality. Instead, he was standing in the open with nothing left to hide behind. Anastasia recognized that look immediately. He had seen it in men who realized too late that they had mistaken access for protection. The room waited for Anastasia to move, to stand, to signal, to retaliate. He didn't. That restraint unsettled everyone more than violence would have. It meant the response would come later, on terms no one in the room could influence. By the time Anastasia finally shifted in his chair, the hierarchy had already been redrawn. Not by force, by exposure. Men had placed themselves without being told to. Allies revealed themselves through restraint. Liabilities exposed themselves through instinct. That second after the click did more work than a gunfight ever could. It showed Anastasia who could be trusted under pressure, and who had already failed without being accused. The night Harlem learned what untouchable means in a low voice, the impact wasn't measured in bodies that night. It was measured in the silences the next morning, and who stopped calling, and who started paying on time, and who stopped speaking about it like it was a rumor. Because when a man turns an assassination attempt into a public lesson, territory doesn't change through bullets. It changes through calculation. By dawn, the story had already settled into something precise, not exaggerated, not softened. A man had tried, he had failed, and he had been left standing long enough for everyone else to understand why that failure mattered more than a death would have. Harlem absorbed the lesson the way it always did, quietly, without crediting a source, without asking questions that didn't need answers. Corners that usually buzzed with speculation went flat. Men who liked to talk suddenly found reasons not to. Names that might have been said out loud the week before stayed trapped behind teeth. Silence became currency. Speaking too freely after a moment like that invited association. Association invited attention. Money moved differently. Collections came early. Debts that had lingered were settled without argument. Middlemen who had taken their time returning calls became punctual, not because Anastasia demanded it, but because men adjusted their risk. They understood the margin for error had narrowed. What unsettled Harlem most wasn't retaliation. It was restraint. Anastasia didn't flood the neighborhood with enforcers. He didn't issue public warnings. He didn't correct anyone loudly. That absence created space, and in that space imagination did the work violence usually does. Men replayed the click in their heads and asked themselves how many steps removed they were from it. Those closest to the plan learned the hardest lesson. They weren't punished immediately. They were watched. Being spared didn't feel like mercy. It felt like probation without terms. They understood survival now depended on never misreading the room again. The word untouchable changed meaning that week. It no longer described a man surrounded by guards or hidden behind walls. It described a man who could sit alone in hostile territory, survive an attempt on his life, and leave without rushing the outcome. Untouchable meant patient. It meant informed. It meant that even when violence failed, authority remained intact. Harlem didn't lose control that night. It recalibrated. Pride stayed. Autonomy stayed. But the belief that outsiders could be corrected quietly was gone. In its place was an understanding that some men didn't need permission to enter. They only needed a reason. Albert Anastasia didn't claim Harlem. He didn't have to. He left behind something more durable than fear. He left behind awareness. And once a city becomes aware of a man like that, it never fully forgets.